great pleasure and honor to welcome you to Durham Castle, to the University of Durham, and to the northeast of England. When I mentioned to people that you were going to come here, the excitement was palpable. The Twitter feeds, which by the way, I don't follow, were apparently very excited, and there's been a great build-up really to your visit. But everyone knows, in a sense, Noam Chomsky. We know your formidable scholarly achievements and your activism, but I thought it would be quite interesting to spend 20 minutes, half an hour with you just talking about how you got to be a political figure. So I thought I might start by asking you about where you came from, about your family, how you grew up, and whether you were always a publicly engaged figure, or were always political as a young person.
My parents were immigrants. My father fled from right near Kiev from the people who are now in power. So in 1913, right before the First World War, my mother came as a baby a couple of years earlier. I grew up in, they were a Jewish family. They lived in a kind of a Jewish cultural ghetto, not a physical ghetto, but they were both Hebrew teachers. My father was a Hebrew scholar, and the environment in which they lived was essentially a Jewish cultural ghetto. I don't think they had any non-Jewish friends, for example. They didn't know it, but we lived in a community that was mostly German and Irish and very anti-Semitic. So I grew up on the streets in sort of running away from the tough Irish kids, you know. And I remember beer parties when Paris fell, for example. They were quite pro-Nazi. And my parents were oblivious to this. They had no conception that anything like this was happening. Those days, children and parents didn't talk to each other. I grew up in the Depression. The family was mostly unemployed working class. And earliest memories, our childhood memories, are people coming to the door trying to sell rags, riding on a trolley with my mother and watching, passing a textile strike where the police are beating people bloody, talking with my relatives about their lives. One uncle had a newsstand, which he himself had never gone past about 4th grade, but very self-educated and very cultivated person. His newsstand became a kind of a center of discussion and debate. A lot of emigres, and I'd sell papers there and listen and so on. And by the time I was about 11 or 12, my parents would allow, we lived in Philadelphia, but my parents would allow me to go to New York by myself, stay with my relatives. I spent a lot of time in those days. Union Square in New York used to be a center for radical offices, Freie Arbeiterstimme, you know, other anarchist, Jewish anarchist office, others, and the street going down below it, 4th Avenue, now all gentrified, used to have a lot of small bookstores, many of them run by recent emigres. Some of them, the ones I happen to be attracted to, by emigres from Spain. And I very quickly got quite interested in the Spanish Civil War, and in particular in the anarchist movement in Spain. In fact, the first article I remember writing was, which I can date precisely, was right after the fall of Barcelona. So it was February 1939, and it was kind of a lament about the spread of fascism over Europe. I'm sure it was not very profound. I hope it's disappeared forever, but that was the topic at least. And from then on, it was more or less the same. When the Second World War broke out right after that, so that became a big issue. I'm very anti-fascist, but quite critical of a lot of the way in which the war was framed and fought. As I'm sure you know, in the United States, there was a differentiated attitude towards the Germans and the Japanese. The Germans were bad people, you know, that's what the propaganda was, but they were not unlike us. The Japanese were just vermin. They had to be destroyed and crushed. And the racism was just incredible. You know, and a number of us were quite critical of that. In fact, the high school where I was happened to be right next to a prisoner of war camp, barbed wire separating them, and there was the students in the school would, during recess, would go out and sort of mock the prisoners, you know, could talk to them across. And a number of us were quite opposed to that, tried to stop it, saying, look, they're human beings like us. They were drafted, they didn't have any choice. Yeah. And then went on. When the British invaded Greece, it was very violent and brutal. I was strongly opposed to that with a tiny group of students, and it just went on from there.
If I could just clarify a little bit, but it sounds like your parents, you make it very clear actually, your parents were not political. They had little awareness of what was going on around them. So was this something about the values of your background, that, you know, you were an immigrant, you came from an immigrant family, you were something of an outsider, so you were both of the US but outside the US at the same time? Do you think that tension in a young person helped illuminate things that some others may not have seen? Because it sounds like from the beginning you had a critical edge, that is to say a critical awareness of the circumstances of your life.
Well, my parents were conventional Roosevelt Democrats. There were splits in the Jewish community at the time. There was a Hebraic and a Yiddishist. My parents, for both of them, their native language was Yiddish, but I never heard a word of Yiddish. Right. They wouldn't talk it because they were on the Hebrew side of the Kulturkampf and the revival of Hebrew. My father was a dedicated Zionist, but in a sense that's not considered Zionism today. He was a follower of Haddam, who wanted to create a cultural center in Palestine that would revive the diaspora culture and so on. And revival of Hebrew was a central part of it. He himself was a Hebrew scholar, worked on medieval Hebrew grammar, actually.
There's an interesting connection.
There. When I was a kid, I read his PhD thesis.
Yes.
But, and that was their world, and I was part of that, of course. With my father, from childhood, Friday night, we'd read Hebrew together, Hebrew literature from the 19th century, and study the Bible, and so on and so forth. But the other side of my life was my own political interests, which came from elsewhere.
By the time you were a young man at university, how would you characterize your kind of political engagement? I mean, you obviously were steeped in a diversity of radical backgrounds. You've already described being drawn to the Spanish anarchists, but I wonder, as your political views developed, whether you understood yourself to be working within a framework, within a tradition, or were you carving something out that was distinctive from more or less from the beginning?
Well, it was a very lively period, remember, the late 1930s, early 40s, but not like the subsequent period at all. And there was I would spend Saturday afternoons in the Philadelphia Public Library, which for some reason had every imaginable radical publication. And I'd just be working through these, every conceivable cult.
Yes.
Had some, by the time I was, say, 12 or 13, I was an anti-Bolshevik leftist, anti-Bolshevik from the left. So I was, a lot of my own personal commitments actually were involved with what was then called Zionism, what would now be called anti-Zionism, a commitment to working for Arab-Jewish cooperation in a binational Palestine based on working class institutions and cooperations of a kind of quasi-anarchist kind, which is not as exotic as it may sound today. Then it was maybe not realistic, but not off the planet, you know. And there was one of the Zionist groups was pretty close to this in some respects, Hashem Eretz Ayir, but I could never join them because they were split between Trotskyite and Stalinist, and I was opposed to both of them, so I was kind of hovered around the fringes. But other than that, it was I wasn't alone. There were people, but not a lot.
Looking back now from where you are today and your extraordinary history, both as an academic but as a public intellectual and critic of American engagements, imperialisms, the war machines, the American self-interest outreach and so on. How would you say your views today are different from, they were when you were a young man? I mean, what are the big changes that you would register as, formative of the Chomsky today, looking back now?
Oddly enough, not much in principle. Of course, I know a lot more that I didn't know then.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, at the time, Second World War, I had a kind of skeptical attitude toward the Pacific War.
Yeah.
But it was only later that I learned about the intricacies of the background and what drove Japan to become a brutal, violent imperialist power. The West had plenty of considerable role in that, the British and the Americans, and the same in other domains. But kind of fundamental principles, other than kind of sharpening, modifying to some extent, I wouldn't say have changed.
So there weren't any trigger points like the Vietnam War, which was, because I was in the US, of course, during the last part of the Vietnam War. I remember in 1974 the sense of celebrations when it was seen that the war was coming to an end. You wouldn't describe the Vietnam War or any successive events as critical in changing your kinds of engagements and the way you stood out as a public.
There were changes. For example, August 6th, 1945 was a change. I was a counselor in a summer camp, a Hebrew-speaking camp, and the news one morning was announced that Hiroshima had been bombed by an atom bomb, and I was shocked, and even more shocked by the fact that nobody cared. People listened and went on to the next activity. In fact, I was so shocked, I just took off by myself, walked off into the woods and sat there for a couple hours and disappeared. And that, I realized at that time, I think nobody could fail to realize that we're now facing the possibility and the likelihood of destroying ourselves. And that was a significant change. The Vietnam War, I followed it in the late 40s and early 50s, which was the crucial period. Didn't really know then what we know now about the internal deliberations. They've been revealed later. But by about 1961 or so, when in 1961 Kennedy sharply escalated the war, it was barely reported, but there were enough tidbits coming through so you could see what was happening. He sent the American Air Force to carry out bombing in South Vietnam under South Vietnamese cover. He initiated chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover, began the programs of rounding people up and into what amounted to concentration camps, strategic hamlets. It was clear that a substantial escalation was going on, and I kind of debated with myself as to how deeply to become involved. I had enough political experience to know that you just can't put one foot in. If you start involvement, it's going to take over. And I had a pretty comfortable life. I had a young family. I had I was a professor at MIT, kind of job that I liked, to do the research I wanted, and I knew perfectly well that if I get involved in this, this is going to change.
Yeah.
And I thought about it for a while, but I did become involved. At the time, it was a very lonely commitment. If you wanted to give a talk on the Vietnam War, say in 1963, it would be in somebody's living room or a church with 4 people. Just to illustrate, you came later, 74,
yes.
but there was an international day of protest against the war in October 1965, and we had an anti-war group at the time, and we decided to have a demonstration on the Boston Common, you know, the
yes.
standard place for political action. There was a demonstration, but it was completely broken up by counter-demonstrators. In fact, I was supposed to be one of the speakers. Nobody could be heard. We were rescued, actually, by a big state police contingent. Didn't like us, but didn't want people to be killed on the Boston Common. You take a look at the Boston Globe the next day, the liberal newspaper, bitterly denouncing the demonstrators. How dare you raise a question about the bombing of North Vietnam. The next International Day of Protest was March 1966, and we realized we couldn't have a public demonstration, so we arranged it in a church, Arlington Street Church, which was one of the centers of anti-war activity. Church was attacked. You know, that's what the mood was like then.
Yeah.
By 1965, I was organizing, one of the people organizing national tax resistance, and in 1966 we began to organize a group called Resist, still exists, which was involved in a variety of forms of anti-war resistance. In fact, we came up for trial in 1968. I was probably going to face a long jail sentence, but the Tet Offensive came along and the government called off the trials. But it was a pretty serious involvement. For years I was taking up a large part of my time and effort. Actually, Jack Rawls, who you studied with, was one of the people who supported the resistance, but quietly. He wasn't a person who was much engaged, but he did support it.
I'm mindful that we have limited time, so I've got really 2 questions I want to ask you. Really, the first one is, given that you are a very well-formed figure, almost by the time we get to the late 60s, how did you appraise the rise of not just the civil rights movement, the 68ers, the explosion of political engagement in the US and Europe at that time, and now looking back at that, how would you characterize the 68 period and its impact in your political life?
Well, by 68, my feeling was it was declining.
Right.
I was not overwhelmed at all by the 68 events. I thought they were mostly negative. The civil rights movement's a different case.
Yeah.
And its history is very revealing. Actually, I went down to the South for demonstrations and so on, but when you say, if you listen to the orations on Martin Luther King Day, you'll notice that they stop with his "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington. That's not where Martin Luther King stopped. He then moved on to class issues and to the North, to racism in the North, and to develop. When he was assassinated, he was supporting a sanitation worker strike, and he was about to organize a poor people's movement, not on the basis of race, just a poor people's movement. Yeah. There was to be a march on Washington. Actually took place after his assassination. They set up a tent city in Washington and tried to appeal for legislation. Tent City was smashed up by the police and they were driven out of Washington. Martin Luther King lost his liberal support when he turned to class issues. And that part of his life has kind of disappeared. It's there, but it's not what's recognized. And that's quite a revealing fact. The Northern liberals were perfectly happy to have him condemn racist sheriffs in Alabama, but not to deal with issues of class in the North.
Indeed.
And this was shifting in the mid-'60s. The anti-war movement had a different trajectory. It was building up, and it did peak in about 68, 69, and it became quite a significant movement.
Indeed.
In fact, surely affected the course of the war. But by 68, it was beginning to split. And the move in the anti-war movement itself, the student movement, was breaking up into a Maoist element, PL, the Progressive Labor, and Weathermen, which were, kind of let's overcome the state by breaking up bank windows and so on, and a lot of sectarianism, and it was kind of dissolving in a way that I thought was dangerous. Actually, one of the main movements that developed, and the one that had, in the long term, the greatest impact on the society, was the women's movement, which was just barely beginning to take off in the late 60s as an organized movement. Of course, origins go way back, and then by the 70s it was a major force.
I make a distinction in thinking about the impact of social movements between those social movements which are, on the one hand, egalitarian, but on the other hand, they are seeking, in a sense, equal access into the system itself. So you could say the civil rights movement and partly some elements of the women's movement were engaged in winning equal rights and equal opportunities. And one reason we might say they were successful, and have been successful in certain profound ways, is that you can appeal to the system to live up to its principles, to ensure, as it were, equal opportunity, to allow space for the civil rights movement and the women's movement to flourish, in contrast with social movements that come, let's say, later, like Occupy, which seek to change the agenda and the structure, as it were, of global financial markets, financial capitalism, American hegemony, and so on and so forth. And there the issue is not access on equal terms, as it were, but the transformation of the organizational principles of the system. And there it's much harder to have an impact. It's harder to change that agenda. And Occupy today is not the force it was. So I wanted to ask you now, I mean, looking back on your time in public engagement and so on, would you say that was a valid distinction or not? And would you say, looking back, that, in a sense, would you agree that the transformation of Western capitalism as we know it and the structure of financial capitalism is a much tougher nut to crack than, as it were, winning equal opportunities, however important that is, as it were, within the structure?
Well, I think the women's movement goes beyond seeking equal opportunities. It was also breaking down attitudes, deep-seated attitudes that justified oppression and domination.
Well, I agree with that.
Internalized by the victims.
Indeed.
A large part of the women's movement was overcoming the internalization of the sense that you must be repressed and dominated.
Indeed.
So if you asked my grandmother, say, whether she was repressed, she would not have known what you're talking about. That's like asking, do I breathe? If you asked my mother, she would know, but didn't think there was anything you could do about it. If you ask my daughter, they'd throw you out of the house. That's a big change.
That's a huge change.
And it's a major change among women and also in men. So I think it's more than just equal access. As far as the civil rights movement is concerned, it's a much more complex issue. You take a look at African American history. There were slaves in 1620. It's a long period. Slavery formally ended with the Civil War, but about 10 years later it was reconstituted. It was in a different form. It was reconstituted by the post-Reconstruction North-South Compact, which essentially granted the South the authority to do what they liked. So what they did was criminalize black life. So if a black man is standing on a corner, he'd be fined $10 for vagrancy, which he couldn't pay. He'd be in prison forever, and so on. It created a new slave labor force. A large part of the American Industrial Revolution was based on slave labor coming out of the prisons. And that lasted, it was not a small component. It was, we're familiar with the chain gangs, that's the agricultural part, but it was mining, steel, a significant part of the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th, early 20th century. It changed at the time when the Second World War came. There were jobs. There was an immigration to the north. There was plenty of labor. You had then about 20 or 30 years in which blacks had relative freedom. A black man could get a job in the auto industry. It was unionized then, so you have a fairly decent job, buy a home, send his kid to college, that sort of thing. And the civil rights movement encapsulated that and formalized some of those rights and expanded them, did give equal rights. But after that it started to return again. By now, take a look at the method that what actually happened since about late 70s, primarily since Reagan, is recriminalizing black life. Right. You take a look at the incarceration system. Up until about 1980, the percentage of the population that was in prison in the United States is pretty much like the Western world, a little on the high end. But after that, it just zooms up.
Yes.
Mostly black men, by now Hispanic men, some women. And it's essentially recreating the system that was constructed in the late 19th century. So access to free access is, it's true for a small sector, but not for the mass of the black population.
Yeah. I mean, these are very important points.
Yeah.
But let's
we
take
go
this.
to Occupy.
Yeah, let's take that.
See, I think Occupy was a reformist movement.
Right.
They were not saying, let's dissolve the financial sector.
Yeah.
They were saying things like, let's impose a financial transaction tax.
Quite.
That's easily accommodated within the existing institutions. In fact, it exists in England. And Occupy was really a tactic, not a movement.
Yeah.
It was important. But it is a tactic, and you can't carry out a tactic beyond a certain point.
Well, let me put the question differently to you. We've just, lived through one of the biggest financial calamities, which nearly pushed the system off the edge. Certainly one of the biggest since the Great Depression. In many sense, the burdens of this crisis have been absorbed, taken off the private sector and absorbed into the public sector and pushed back onto the relatively immobile population with higher taxes. If you ask city traders today in London what's changed, they will say very little. In other words, somewhat as Marx said, the state is a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, and if there are huge costs to bear, they are passed on to the movements, the middle classes and working classes. The labour movement today is weaker than it's been for some time. The system of industrial and financial capitalism is global. The rise of Asia is partly their success in engaging with this economic system. China brings together two of the greatest ideologies of the 20th century, nationalism and capitalism, into a successful re-entry into the global order. Where is the spirit of, what carries the spirit of criticism today? What carries the spirit of criticism today of that complex system, that now global system of capitalism? Labour movements, certainly in relation to this, seem weaker than and more disorganized than ever before. Would you agree with that or not?
The labour movement is weaker than it has been, but this is a cyclic pattern. Take the United States again. There was quite a powerful labor movement in the late 19th century, very powerful. It was taking over, it was running cities in western Pennsylvania and so on, very substantial. It was pretty much smashed by Woodrow Wilson and the Red Scare. in the post-World War period. 1920s labor was essentially dead. One of the great labor historians, David Montgomery, has a book called, I think it's called The Fall of the House of Labor. He's talking about the 1920s. It was serious decline. 1930s it revived, and it was the vital force that basically spurred the New Deal legislation.
Yes.
CIO organizing, sit-down strikes, which are very frightening to management because they're just a step before taking over the factory. And that did lead to welfare state legislation of a significant kind. Immediately afterwards, there was a business reaction. By the late 1930s, it began. That's when you had the movement for scientific methods of strike breaking and so on. It was put on hold during the war. After the war, it started in force. Strong Taft-Hartley, 1947, huge propaganda efforts which are quite astonishing in scale to try to turn the population against labor. Labor made its own mistakes. The American labor movement tried to make a compact with capital. We'll work together, you know. And that compact will be called off by business as soon as they want to. And the labor movement began its decline at that point. By now, in the United States, it's maybe 7%, less than 7% of the private private workforce. Public sector unions are still more protected, but they're under attack. But that's happened before, and it could revive again. And in fact, it is reviving again in an interesting way. So if you go to, there's in the old Rust Belt, say Northern Ohio, Indiana, there's a revival of something new, worker-owned enterprises. So take Youngstown, Ohio. It was a major steel town. In 1977 or so, the U.S. Steel decided to close down its Youngstown enterprises. This is a town that was built by the labor movement, all surrounding the steel, with all everything that proliferates from it and so on. The union wanted to buy the steel company and take it over. The steel executives didn't want to do it, went to the courts, union lost, but they didn't give up. They moved towards small-scale worker-owned enterprises, which are now proliferating in Northern Ohio. That's a possible germ of an alternative form of organization and activism, which actually has a revolutionary potential. It changes the structure of the system, if it can succeed. That's one kind of development. If you look around, say take college students, that sector of the population, they're much more politically engaged now than they ever have been. Except for, there was a very brief period, late 1960s, when there was a lot of student activism of a mixed kind. But now it's much broader. Environmental issues, women's issues, solidarity movements. They're not, there's nothing kind of coordinated, you know, there's no movement you can point to, but a lot of ferment, a lot of opposition to the corporatization of the universities, many things happening. It could coalesce into something.
Let me finish by asking you this question. One way to put it would be, what keeps you awake at night? You know, what keeps you awake at night would be one way to put my last question to you. But another way to put it would be, how would you characterize today the dimensions of your engagements in the public domain? What are your priorities? And how would you sketch that?
I mean, there are plenty of problems, but there are two that are absolutely overwhelming. One of them goes back to August 6, 1945. We're still living under the shadow of potential self-destruction. And if you take a look at that record, it is horrendous. It's a miracle that we've survived.
Yeah.
Anyone who looks closely at the record of near nuclear war, very near, minutes, is shocking. And that's still there. In fact, it's growing. But the other, which we weren't really aware of until the 1970s, is the threat of environmental disaster, which is an overwhelming threat. We're really at a point in human history where we have to decide, are we going to destroy the prospects for decent existence? That's never happened before.
Indeed.
And it's very close. Everything else kind of fades into the background in the face of these two kind of overwhelming dangers.
Are there grounds for optimism?
Well, I like to think of my favorite comment from the Analects, Confucius. There's a definition there of the exemplary person, presumably the master himself. It's the person who keeps on trying even though he knows there is no hope. I don't think it's quite that bad. There isn't much hope. There's some. We have to keep on trying.
Noam Chomsky, thank you very much.